I didn't even flinch when the latest bar charge hit my phone. $128.90, at the same dive where my son slurred apologies he never meant. The same bar he paid for with my medical bracelet, the one meant to alert paramedics if my heart gave out. My hands didn't shake this time. Instead, I reached for his forgotten wallet on my counter. He used my lifeline to buy himself drinks, so I used his credit card to buy the judge's time. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Marjorie had never liked doctors, not even the urgent care variety. They always seemed in such a rush, as if your illness was just another paperwork task on their to-do list. The nurse had asked her to sit and wait while they ran a few checks, blood pressure, oxygen levels, and now, in the sterile quiet of the examination room, Marjorie tried to keep her thoughts from drifting too far. Her fingers nervously traced the edges of her medical. It was something she always wore, even if it was just to make herself. Her heart hadn't been the same since the arrhythmia diagnosis years ago. The bracelet wasn't just a tool, it was her anchor. It made her feel like she still had control of something. She let out a small sigh, then glanced down at her phone as the screen lit up with a bank alert. It was just a notification, a text from her bank, alerting her to recent transactions. Her pulse quickened as she swiped through the messages, not expecting much more than the usual bills. Maybe a grocery charge. But then, she saw it. A charge. $95.21. At the corner tap, just 2 blocks from her house. Her stomach lurched. The name was familiar. Almost too familiar. She'd heard that name mentioned in passing by Eric, her son, who sometimes dropped by after a shift, reeking of alcohol. But $95? She didn't think Eric could ever afford such a splurge on his own. A second charge caught her eye. $103.45. Same bar. A day earlier. Her hands shook. She clicked open the details and scanned them again. The charges weren't an accident. They were deliberate. One after another, like clockwork. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't the first time. Marjorie's mind raced through memories of the past week. Did she let him use her account for something? Did she? She tried to remember, but there was only a cloud of confusion. No, she was certain. This was Eric. He'd done this. The door opened with a soft click, and the nurse returned, her eyes glancing briefly at Marjorie. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Marjorie. Marjorie managed a thin smile and nodded, though her hand still gripped the phone with white-knuckled force. "Fine. Just fine," she said, her voice a little tight. As the nurse moved around her, checking the IV drip, Marjorie felt a heat rise in her chest. The anger was slow to burn but steady. Relentless. She knew Eric had issues. She knew he drank too much, that his life was a series of impulsive decisions. But this felt like betrayal. To use her identity, to use her own account to fund his mess of a life. When the nurse left, Marjorie sat in silence for a moment, heart pounding. She needed to confront him. She had to. Hours later, she was back home. She hadn't told Eric about the charges yet. She wasn't sure if she could. Instead, she found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the empty chairs around the table. She heard the murmur of conversation from the living room, the television's drone filling the otherwise still house. Eric was sprawled on the couch, as usual, his eyes bloodshot, his breath thick with whiskey. Dana sat beside him, absently flipping through a magazine. Their daughter, Sophie, was quieter than usual. She hovered near the door, her eyes darting from her parents to the floor. Marjorie stood there for a long moment, considering her next move. When she finally stepped into the room, Eric didn't even bother to look up. "Mom, you're back. How's the old ticker?" Eric's voice slurred slightly, a smirk curling at the corner of his lips. Marjorie took a breath, her voice steady. "I saw the charges, Eric. $200 at that bar." Eric's eyes flicked over to her, his smirk widening. "Just a couple beers, Mom," he said, like it was nothing. Like it didn't matter. Dana rolled her eyes as if Marjorie was making a big deal out of nothing. "It's not a big deal, Marge. He's just helping you out, right?" Marjorie's eyes flickered over to Sophie. She saw her granddaughter standing stiffly by the doorway, her shoulders tight, her gaze fixed on the floor. Sophie always had this quiet way of seeing right through things, like she could tell when things weren't right. Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Grandma, it is." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "He's stealing from you." The words hung in the air like a Eric's face faltered for a moment, but only a moment, before his expression returned to its usual cocky disdain. "Don't make this something it's not," he sneered, turning his attention back to the television, as if the matter was already settled. But Marjorie wasn't finished. She felt the anger inside of her, sharper now, cutting through the fog. "It's theft, Eric," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm, each word carrying the weight of years of frustration. "You're stealing from me, and it has to stop." Before Eric could respond, Irene stepped in from the kitchen, arms crossed, her expression tight with judgment. "That's theft, plain and simple," Irene said, her voice low but unwavering. Her eyes were like steel, and the look she shot at Eric was one of pure disgust. Eric's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Dana just gave a lazy shrug, her eyes already half closed in boredom. Marjorie's heart thudded in her chest. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about something deeper, something harder to ignore. A son who had crossed a line, a family broken by grief. She stood there in the silence, the weight of the moment pressing in, and in that silence, she knew that something had shifted. The old Marjorie, timid, uncertain, was gone. And the new Marjorie was just beginning to rise. The game was on. The evening after the confrontation had left Marjorie feeling hollow, as though the world had tipped on its axis. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this angry, this betrayed. She sat at the kitchen table, the dim light from the old lamp above casting long shadows across the papers spread before her. Receipts, bank statements, the same bar charges that had started this whole mess. Her hands shook slightly as she clicked through her account on the phone, the cold metallic click of the touchscreen almost soothing in its rhythmic monotony. But every new charge felt like a slap. Each one was bigger than the last. $95.21, $103.45, $128.90. The numbers blurred together in front of her. She scrolled down further, the total creeping up and up until she saw it. $1,200. The total, in bold black text, hit her like a punch to the gut. Marjorie closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe. This wasn't just a couple of beers like Eric had tried to brush it off. This was premeditated, calculated, a direct assault on her trust, her finances, her very sense of security. The charges were all clustered around one place, the corner tap. She wasn't sure how long she'd been sitting there when Eric came into the room. His gait staggered, no doubt from the booze that had been flowing through his system all day. He flopped into the chair across from her, the smirk that never seemed to leave his face a little more strained tonight. "What's this, Mom? You're still on about the bar tab?" He slurred, eyes bloodshot and half-lidded. "It's just compensation for helping you out." Marjorie let the words sink in. Helping me out. That was how he saw it, wasn't it? As though he was entitled to take what he wanted, as though she owed him something. Her eyes flicked to the bank statement in her. She couldn't let this slide. Not now. "You think this is helping me?" Her voice was steady, unwavering. "This is stealing, Eric." Eric shrugged nonchalantly. "Come on, Mom. You know what it's like. I've been looking out for you." His voice was smooth, but there was an underlying edge to it, something she hadn't noticed before, something dark. Dana appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the exchange with a bored expression, as though it was just another family argument. "It's not a big deal, Marge," Dana said, dismissively waving a hand. "He deserves it. He's helping you, and honestly, who else is gonna? You can't handle things like you used to." Sophie's voice cut through the air, sharp and accusing. "No, Mom. He's stealing from you. That's not helping." She stood at the end of the hallway, her face flushed with anger, her fists clenched at her sides. "This isn't helping. This is theft." Marjorie turned slowly, meeting Sophie's eyes. There was fire in her granddaughter's words, a truth that echoed painfully in. Sophie was the only one who seemed to understand. Marjorie nodded once, her chin lifting in silent acknowledgement. "Thank you, Sophie," Marjorie murmured, her voice heavy with emotion. Eric scoffed and leaned back in his chair, clearly growing agitated. "Oh, please. She's just a kid. What does she know?" The old Marjorie, the one who had tolerated Eric's antics for far too long, might have shrunk back at that. She might have stayed silent, worried about rocking the boat, about keeping the peace. But not anymore. The fire that had ignited within her after seeing the total on that statement wouldn't be easily extinguished. Marjorie's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as she forced herself to stay calm. She was done letting him walk all over her. "I'm writing this down," she said, voice steady. She took a pen and began methodically documenting each charge, each date. Her hand moved across the paper, slower now, as if each word required the full weight of her resolve. Every single charge, every transaction, everything. Eric rolled his eyes but said nothing more. Dana, too, didn't argue. There was a quiet tension in the room that felt heavier than the weight of the bills piling up in front of Marjorie. Irene, who had been standing quietly near the window, her arms crossed, spoke up then, her voice low, but carrying an undeniable weight of "Build a wall of proof, Marjorie. Every date, every dollar. You don't let him slip away from this." Marjorie met Irene's gaze and nodded once. Her neighbor's words struck her like a lightning bolt. Sharp, direct, and exactly what she needed to. This wasn't just about the money. It was about showing Eric, once and for all, that he couldn't walk all over her anymore. The old Marjorie, soft and forgiving, was gone. The new Marjorie was rising, and she was ready for the fight. As she wrote down the final charge on the last page, Marjorie's phone buzzed again. Another alert. Another charge from the bar. The total was climbing, each number adding more weight to the case she was building. Eric wasn't going to get away with this. Not this time. With a deep breath, she slammed the pen down on the table. "I'm done being the victim." Her voice cracked the silence that had settled over the room. The weight of the evening's revelation still clung to Marjorie, thick and suffocating, as she sat at the kitchen table once again. This time, though, it wasn't the chaotic blur of emotions or confrontation. It was something far more methodical, cold even. She had already been at this for hours, sorting receipts, checking the dates, reviewing the bank statement. The tally on the table now was overwhelming, but it wasn't just the amounts that stung anymore. It was the methodical betrayal that Eric had laid bare with every swipe of her account. Her phone buzzed on the table. Another alert. Another $50 charge. It felt endless, the way the charges piled up, all tied to that same damn bar. The corner tap, her son's kingdom of irresponsibility. She picked up the phone, every muscle tense as she called the bank. "Hi, this is Marjorie Lane. I'd like a detailed transaction report for my account. Yes, from the last 2 weeks." She spoke slowly, firmly, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. "I believe there have been unauthorized charges." Her throat tightened as she said the words. Unauthorized charges. It sounded so cold, so clinical. The bank representative was helpful, a voice that felt almost too cheerful for what was unfolding. She patiently went over the details of each transaction spelling out the charges in crisp, unemotional terms. Every time a charge from the corner tap came up, Marjorie felt a sickening jolt in her gut. The total now was creeping close to $1,500. She jotted down the new figures, the exact dates, the times. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was planned, cold, calculated. She disconnected the call, setting the phone down with a trembling hand, but before she could allow herself to breathe, there was a knock at the door. It was Irene, her neighbor, standing in the doorway with a camera in her hand, a determined look on her face. "You've got to capture it all, Marjorie," she said, stepping into the room with purpose. "Every receipt, every transaction, you need proof." Marjorie didn't hesitate. She handed over the stack of receipts and the printed bank statement. Irene took one look, her brow furrowing as she set the camera to work. The flash illuminated the paper in sharp bursts of light as she snapped pictures of the transaction log. Click, click, click. I'm getting the bracelet too, Irene said as she moved around the room, her voice steady and sure. It's part of the evidence. If he's using it to drain your account, we need to show it all. Marjorie felt a strange sense of calm wash over her as Irene clicked away. There was something almost satisfying about watching the events unfold, watching as the pieces of her case came little by little. The betrayal, the theft, the manipulation, it all felt so clear now, and she wasn't about to let Eric get away with it. I'll get the bracelet, Marjorie said, pushing herself up from the table. She moved to the drawer where she kept it, the small, simple bracelet that had been her lifeline in a world of constant medical uncertainties. She hesitated for a moment as her fingers traced the familiar metal. It had always been a comfort, a symbol of her control over her own health. Now it felt like a tool of exploitation. She handed it to Irene, who positioned it carefully in front of the camera lens, clicking a few more photos. Marjorie felt the bitter sting of the betrayal rise up in her chest. But she bit it back. This was the evidence she needed. This was the first step in taking back control. The next day, Sophie came over with a camera of her own, her movements careful as she snuck around the house. I got a few shots of him at the bar, Sophie said quietly, her voice filled with quiet rebellion. I didn't get a lot, but enough to show he was using your bracelet to. Marjorie took the photos from Sophie, her heart heavy as she looked at the images. There was Eric, slouched at the bar, a half-empty glass in front of him, the distinctive bracelet visible on his wrist. It was a gut punch to see him so brazen, so unaware of the consequences of his action. Sophie's eyes were filled with disgust, but there was also something else, something deeper. This is wrong, Grandma, she whispered, almost to herself. He can't get away with this. Marjorie squeezed her granddaughter's shoulder, the warmth of the gesture a small comfort in the middle of the storm they were weathering. No, he won't, she said softly, her voice steely with resolve. Irene returned a few hours later, this time with a stack of papers in hand. She laid them out in front of Marjorie, organized, meticulous, a perfect record of Eric's theft. It was a wall of evidence, a mountain of receipts, bank statements, and photos. Every transaction, every date. This is it, Irene said, her voice low but confident. Now it's a case. You've got everything you need to go to a lawyer. Marjorie looked at the pile before her, feeling a sense of power build inside her. It wasn't just about getting back the money. This wasn't about a few $100s or a small fight. This was about taking back her life, about holding her son accountable for what he had done. For the first time in a long while, Marjorie felt something she hadn't in years: hope. The kind of hope that comes from knowing you're on the right side of the battle, that justice is no longer something you wait for, but something you fight for. As she placed the last receipt in the binder, her hands steadied. This isn't over, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. And for the first time in a long time, Marjorie Lane was ready to face whatever came next. Marjorie had never stepped foot in a law office before, and yet, here she was, sitting in an austere room with polished wood floors and heavy mahogany furniture, the scent of old books and leather clinging to the air. The walls were lined with shelves filled with legal texts, their spines stark and, like the challenge she knew. Marcus Bell was an imposing figure. At 58, he had the kind of presence that made even the most seasoned criminal lawyer look up in awe. His gray suit, sharp and pressed, contrasted sharply with the more comfortable clothes Marjorie had grown used to wearing. But it wasn't his appearance that caught her attention. It was the way he looked at the evidence she had brought with her. The binder of receipts, bank statements, and photographs sat between them, thick with the weight of her son's betrayal. He flipped through the binder, each page making a soft rustling sound as he scanned the details. Marjorie's heart pounded in her chest. Was this enough? Was it really airtight? She had gathered everything she could think of, every receipt, every charge, every damning piece of evidence. But there was still a part of her that feared it wasn't enough. Marcus stopped at the final page, his fingers lingering on a photo of Eric, drunk at the bar, the bracelet unmistakably on his wrist. He looked up at Marjorie, his expression unreadable for a moment. "This is airtight fraud, Mrs. He said, his voice steady, unwavering. There's no doubt about it. His words hit her like a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had expected him to be more measured, more cautious, but instead, his confidence wrapped around her like a blanket of reassurance. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. We'll file a complaint for financial exploitation. We'll freeze your bracelet account and reroute the funds to a new bank account, and we'll ensure that your son doesn't get his hands on another cent of your money. Marjorie's mind raced as he spoke, her pulse quickening. This could work. This could really work. But there was one thing she wasn't sure about. She leaned forward slightly, her voice cautious. "And Sophie?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "She wants to test. She says she'll stand by me." Marcus met her gaze with a sharp, appraising look. "The more evidence we have, the better. If Sophie is willing to testify, it'll only strengthen the case." He paused for a moment, and Marjorie could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. "But it's not just about the money, Mrs. Lane. It's about ensuring your son understands the consequences of his action. We'll make sure he knows what's at stake." The room was silent for a beat, save for the hum of the office's air conditioning. Marjorie could feel her hands tremble in her lap, but she didn't let it show. She had already been through the worst of it. This was the moment when things would start to shift. She would be the one to take control. "I'm not weak," she said quietly, but firmly, meeting Marcus's gaze with unflinching resolve. "He's the one who's weak. I've let him take from me for far too long." Marcus studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing just slightly, but there was a flicker of something like approval in them. "I can see that," he said with a slight nod. "You're not just a victim anymore. You're a fighter." Her lips curled into a tight smile at that. It felt strange, but in a good way. The old Marjorie, the one who never rocked the boat, the one who let her son walk all over her, was gone. And in her place, someone else had emerged. A woman who was done being taken advantage of. A woman who had finally had enough. She took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest, but she felt stronger than she had in years. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let Eric win. Marcus stood up, motioning for her to do the same. "I'll have the paperwork drawn up and the complaint filed as soon as possible. But I'll warn you, Marjorie, this won't be easy. Your son won't take this lying down." Marjorie nodded, the fire inside her simmering. She wasn't afraid of a fight. In fact, it was the first time in a long while that she welcomed it. As she stood and gathered her things, ready to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that the path ahead was one that would change everything. This was no longer about the money. This was about power. About taking back what was hers. About erasing Eric from her life. Once and for all. As she walked out of the office and into the cool Chicago air, the weight of her decision settled over her. She felt it in her bones. This was the moment she would take back control. And nothing was going to. The morning had barely begun when Marjorie found herself once again in the kitchen, the sound of the coffee machine filling the otherwise quiet house. She had spent the night restless, tossing and turning, consumed by the legal battle that was now underway. But today was different. Today, she had a plan. Eric's latest outburst had left a trail of destruction in its wake, his frustration still thick in the air. He'd stormed in the night before, ranting and raving about the injustice of it all. "You think you can just take what's mine?" he had yelled, slamming the door behind him, the bitter scent of alcohol trailing him like a cloud. Marjorie had kept her distance, not wanting to provoke him further, but in the back of her mind, she knew one thing. He had made a mistake. Eric had left his wallet on the counter during his tirade, something he always did when he was too drunk to remember where he. Marjorie had noticed it almost immediately, her eyes narrowing with a quiet, calculating resolve. She had waited for the right moment, her heart steady, before she reached over and grabbed it. The weight of the leather wallet felt strangely heavy in her hand. It wasn't just a wallet. It was a tool, a way in. She knew Eric well enough by now to understand that in his anger, he had left the one thing he valued most behind, his credit card. Marjorie slid it from the wallet with practiced ease, her fingers brushing over the embossed name. She could almost hear the echoes of his words, the insults, the threats. "This is my life. My future, my money. It was time to make him pay for the mess he had created. She moved quickly, snapping a photo of the card, the camera flash briefly illuminating the dark kitchen. It was a small action, but it felt monumental, like a quiet rebellion against all the years of taking the back. No more. If Eric wanted to play dirty, so be it. She was going to play smarter. Later that afternoon, Marcus Bell was on the other end of the line, his voice calm but professional. "I've received the card information, Mrs. Lane. I'll use it for the filing and court fees as we discussed. It'll add another layer to the case." Marjorie nodded, her lips curling slightly. The idea of using Eric's own card to fuel his legal defeat almost too perfect. She could already hear his protests when the time came, the righteous indignation as he realized he had just funded his. It was the ultimate irony. "If he wants to pay tabs, let him pay mine," she murmured, a small, satisfied grin tugging at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about making him realize the consequences of his actions. Every charge he'd racked up at the corner, every drop of alcohol he'd consumed with her hard-earned cash. This was the price he was going to. Irene, who had come over earlier to help organize the paperwork, overheard Marjorie's comment. She paused, holding a folder in her hands, and then burst out laughing. The sound was so unexpected, so genuine, that it startled Marjorie for a moment. But then, it felt good. It felt like victory. "Marjorie, you are genius," Irene exclaimed, wiping a tear from her eye. "He's going to lose his mind when he finds out." She set the folder down and leaned back in her chair, still grinning. "This is more than payback. It's brilliant." Marjorie smiled, a warmth blooming inside her chest. "It's not payback. It's justice," she corrected softly, but there was no mistaking the pride in her voice. She was starting to feel it now, the weight lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't just taking back control, she was crafting the path forward. Sophie, who had been quiet until now, looked up from her homework, her eyes full of that quiet admiration that only a granddaughter could. "Grandma, that's genius," she said, her voice full of wonder. Marjorie met her granddaughter's gaze, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing moment. Sophie had seen the worst of Eric, had witnessed the damage he had caused, and now she was standing by Marjorie's side, ready to fight for what was right. "This isn't just about us," Marjorie said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "This is about showing Eric that he can't just take from people and walk away. It ends now." She turned back to the kitchen counter, where the binder of receipts, statements, and photographs sat neatly organized, a testament to her determination. She was building something solid, something that couldn't be undone. The evidence was overwhelming, and with Marcus's expertise and Sophie's willingness to testify, they had a chance to make sure Eric never crossed that line again. As the evening drew closer, the weight of what they were about to do began to settle into Marjorie's bones. It wasn't fear that filled her now. It was a quiet certainty. She had fought the hardest battles of her life already. This one, though, would be the one that defined everything that came. Eric would never know what hit him. The door slammed open with such force that it rattled the windows, the sound echoing through the quiet house like a shot. Marjorie didn't flinch. Didn't even look up from the paperwork she was reviewing. She knew it was coming. Eric was back, his fury thick and suffocating. "You think you can just do this to me?" His voice bellowed, booming with a mix of rage and disbelief. Marjorie could feel the heat of his presence even without looking, the air suddenly thick with his anger. Eric's face was flushed, his eyes wide with that familiar manic gleam. The alcohol had worked its magic once again, turning his anger into something uncontrollable, unpredictable. He stormed into the living room, throwing his jacket to the side, his hands trembling as he gestured wildly. "You're not taking my money. You can't just steal from me and get away with it." His words were a mix of venom and desperation. The entitlement in his voice. How dare she challenge him? How dare she make him face the consequences of his action? Was almost suffocating. Dana, ever the enabler, stood just behind him, her eyes half-lidded, arms crossed as she watched the scene unfold with a bored expression, as though this were just another argument. "It's just money, Eric. You need to calm down. You're making a bigger deal out of it than it is. Eric's glare shifted to her, his face contorting with frustration. Don't you ever defend her, he screamed, his voice so loud it made Sophie wince from where she stood at the other end of the room. The tension was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm, thick and heavy. Sophie, looking pale and shaken, retreated a few steps, her body visibly tensed, ready to flee at any moment. She glanced at her grandmother, whose posture remained unshaken, calm, almost detached in her composure. The coldness in Marjorie's gaze as she met her son's furious eyes was something Sophie had never seen before. It was not the woman who had once sheltered him, who had coddled his failures and tried to fix everything. No, this was something else. This was a woman who had had enough. Eric turned on her neck, his fists clenched at his sides. You stole from me, Mom! How dare you? Do you have any idea what this is going to do to me? His voice cracked, but it wasn't from sadness. It was from sheer, unrestrained rage. Marjorie stayed seated at the kitchen table, her fingers moving over the pages of receipts, meticulously documenting the day's events. The sound of the pen against paper was like a metronome to Eric's chaos, grounding her in the reality of what was happening. She didn't rise to meet his fury. She didn't yell back. She didn't need to. She just kept writing, her hand steady, her eyes cold and unwavering. You're not going to get away with this, Eric continued, his words coming faster now, almost frantic. You're going to pay for this, do you hear me? Dana snickered softly, egging him on from the— Yeah, Marge, you're really asking for trouble. You can't just take his money like that. He's your son. Marjorie's pen paused for a moment, the tip hovering over the page. She felt the sting of Dana's words, but it didn't shake her. She didn't need her son's approval or her daughter-in-law's condemnation. She didn't need anyone but herself. Eric's next words snapped through the air like a whip. You're nothing but an old woman with nothing left. I'm going to make sure you regret this. And that's when the air changed. The tension, the anger, the frantic energy, it all shifted in an instant. Marjorie's fingers remained steady on the pen, her gaze fixed on the paper in front of her. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't anything but focused. Irene, who had been in the back of the house, stepped into the room at just the right moment. She glanced quickly at Marjorie and then back at Eric, her eyes narrowing. Without a word, she reached for the phone in her pocket, dialing the police. Eric's voice rose even higher as he yelled at Marjorie, but Irene's steady movements cut through the chaos like a lifeline. She spoke quietly into the phone, her voice calm but firm. Yes, we need assistance. There's a disturbance, a potential threat of violence. She glanced over at Marjorie once more. I'm calling the police, This has gone far enough. Marjorie's eyes flicked briefly to Sophie, who was now standing behind the couch, her face pale with fear. Marjorie gave her a small nod, just enough to let Sophie know that she was in control, that nothing would happen to her, not while she was here. Eric's rant continued, but now there was a sense of futility to it. It was clear to anyone in the room. His power, his manipulation, it was slipping through his fingers. Marjorie was no longer intimidated. She wasn't backing down. Irene turned to her, her voice low. We need to make sure everything is documented. The police will need to know what's happened here. And I'll be here to back you up. Marjorie nodded, her hand still steady as she wrote. She wasn't just documenting what Eric had done to her finances, she was documenting the destruction he had caused, the destruction that had led her to this very moment. In the distance, they could hear the sirens wailing. The end of Eric's outburst was near. But for Marjorie, this was only the beginning. The weight of her decision settled deeper into her chest. Eric would have to face the consequences of his action, no matter how loud or desperate his rage became. And this time, it wasn't going to be her who would lose. The courthouse was imposing, its stone pillars standing tall and silent, casting long shadows over the entryway as Marjorie stepped through the double doors. She felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest, the uncertainty mixing with a growing sense of resolve. This was it. The moment everything she had fought for would be laid out in front of the judge. No more running. No more excuses. Marcus had been calm when he'd filed the motion for restitution and the injunction, a legal way of freezing Eric's access to her. But now that they were here, everything felt real. The fight was no longer theoretical. It was tangible. And as she stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, her eyes scanning the crowd of people waiting for their turn, Marjorie couldn't help but wonder if she was truly ready to face her son in a place like this. The doors to the courtroom swung open with a sharp creak, and Marcus gave her a reassuring nod. "Let's go," he said quietly, guiding her to the benches in the back of the room. Inside, the atmosphere was far colder than anything Marjorie had. The polished wood of the bench, the gleam of the judge's gavel, the stern faces of the people sitting in their seats. Everything about the space radiated authority and judgment. This wasn't just a trial. This was a reckoning, and Marjorie was ready to face it head-on. Eric was already sitting at the defendant's table, looking out of place in the austere surroundings. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous tension that was impossible to hide. Dana sat beside him, her eyes darting between the people in the room, clearly uncomfortable in this environment, yet still trying to project an air of indifference. But what caught Marjorie's attention most was Sophie, standing in the witness box, her face pale but determined. Sophie had agreed to testify, and it was a choice that weighed heavily on Marjorie's heart. Her granddaughter, barely 6, was about to stand against her own father, to speak out against the man who had manipulated and exploited the very woman who had raised her. Marjorie could see the apprehension in Sophie's eyes, but also the quiet courage. "Miss Lane, you may proceed," the judge said, his voice firm, his eyes never leaving the paperwork in front of him. His tone was one of practiced neutrality, but there was something else there too, something darker. Sophie stood tall, her voice wavering only slightly as she began to speak. "I've seen how my father treats my grandmother. He takes advantage of her kindness, of her trust. He used her bracelet without permission to buy drinks. I saw him at the bar, using it to pay for his tabs." Sophie's eyes met the judge's, her resolve solidifying. "It's not just the money, it's what he's doing to her. And it's wrong." Marjorie's heart swelled with pride as Sophie continued, telling the court about the receipts, the photos, and the countless times Eric had used the bracelet for his own gain. There was no hesitation in her voice now, no fear. Sophie was speaking not just for Marjorie, but for the truth. From the defendant's table, Dana shifted uncomfortably, but it was Eric's outburst that brought everything to a head. "This is all lies!" he screamed, rising from his seat, his fists clenched at his sides. "She's just a kid. She doesn't know what she's talking about. You're all just trying to ruin my life." The judge slammed his gavel down hard, the sound cracking through the air like thunder. "Enough!" His voice was final, no longer willing to entertain Eric's outbursts. "This is not the time or the place for childish tantrums." Dana shot her husband a nervous glance, but Eric only scowled, slumping back into his seat. Marjorie didn't flinch. She'd heard all of Eric's excuses before, and this time it wasn't going to work. Irene, sitting beside Marjorie, leaned in slightly. "He stole her heartbeat," Irene whispered, her voice laced with. The words hung in the air like a weight, resonating deeper than any amount of money ever could. The judge shifted in his seat, glancing at the pile of evidence in front of him, the receipts, the photographs, the statements. He looked back at Eric with clear distaste, his gaze sharp. "This is a clear case of financial exploitation, Mr. the judge said, his voice measured but stern. "You have used your mother's medical bracelet to defraud her. You will answer for this, and you will make restitution." Eric's face twisted in anger, but there was no doubt in Marjorie's mind that the judge had already made his decision. She felt a sense of satisfaction wash over her, the kind that came from knowing the truth had been laid bare for all to see. But it wasn't over yet. There would be restitution. There would be consequences. And while this was just the beginning of the legal battle, Marjorie knew one thing for certain. She had taken the first step. She wasn't going to lose this fight. Not this time. Not ever again. The air inside the courtroom felt colder now, sharper, as the doors swung open again. Eric strode in, his shoulders squared, his smirk as wide and self-assured as ever. The expression was an old one, the one he wore when he thought he could charm his way out of anything. But today, the room wasn't buying it. Not anymore. He glanced at Marjorie, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he could still intimidate her with that cocky grin. But Marjorie didn't flinch. She wasn't here to be scared. She wasn't here to be manipulated. She was here to watch her son get what he deserved. Dana followed Eric into the courtroom, her movements slower, more cautious. She seemed to sense the weight of the room, her usual nonchalance replaced by a look of faint anxiety. She sat down beside Eric, her gaze flicking nervously to Marjorie, who was seated across the aisle. Marjorie felt the familiar unease rise in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had come too far for her resolve to crack now. As Marcus settled beside her, opening a thick folder filled with receipts, photographs, and detailed documentation, she focused on the task at hand. The judge called the room to order, his voice echoing across the chamber. We are here today to address the charges of financial exploitation, specifically the unauthorized use of a medical bracelet linked to Miss Lane's bank account. Eric, sitting across from her, was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression still smug. He looked like a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. He hadn't learned yet, Marjorie thought. He hadn't learned that there were consequences for action. Marcus rose from his seat, steady and professional, his voice ringing out clear and authoritative as he addressed the court. Your Honor, we have documented evidence of repeated fraudulent charges made to Miss Lane's account. The defendant, Mr. Eric Lane, used his mother's medical bracelet at a local bar without her consent, racking up over $1,500 in unauthorized charges. We also have photographs of Mr. Lane at the bar, using the bracelet to pay for his drinks. As he spoke, Marcus held up the first few pages of the receipts, each one displaying the familiar name of the corner tab. The receipts were arranged in neat rows, with every charge meticulously highlighted in red ink. The room was silent except for the rustling of paper and the soft clicking of the projector as it illuminated the images of Eric, caught on camera, drinking and laughing with friends, the bracelet unmistakably on his wrist. The photos painted a clear picture, each one worse than the last. Marjorie felt a tightness in her chest as she watched the images flicker across the screen. These weren't just charges on a bank statement. These were moments of betrayal. Each photo a testament to how her son had exploited her trust. Next, Marcus turned to Sophie, his voice soft but firm as he called her to the stand. The moment her name was mentioned, Marjorie felt a pang of pride mixed with a flash of concern. Sophie stepped up, her legs trembling slightly, but her posture strong, her eyes focused on the judge. Miss Lane, Marcus began, could you tell the court what you witnessed when your father used your grandmother's bracelet? Sophie's voice was steady, though her hands gripped the edges of the witness stand tightly. I saw my dad at the bar. I saw him use Grandma's bracelet to pay. He didn't ask her permission. He just used it, over and over again. He thought it was fine, like it was his right. The words hit the room with a quiet intensity. Sophie's gaze never wavered. Not from the judge, not from her father. Marjorie felt her heart swell with pride. Sophie wasn't just testifying for her. She was testifying for herself, for the truth. From the corner of her eye, Marjorie saw Eric's smirk falter. For the first time, he wasn't in control. The judge nodded, his eyes turning to Eric. Mr. Lane, would you like to respond to the evidence presented against you? Eric shot to his feet, his face flushing with frustration. This is all exaggeration, he spat, his voice rising. None of this is true. Sophie's just a kid. What does she know? She's got no idea what she's talking about. And these photos? You're all just trying to make me look bad. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating in the silent courtroom. But his words were empty now, a desperate attempt to regain control. The judge's expression darkened. Mr. Lane, you will remain silent until it is your turn to. I will not tolerate interruptions. His gavel came down with a sharp crack. Continue, Mr. Bell. Marcus didn't even flinch. Thank you, Your Honor, he said smoothly, As he turned back to the pile of evidence, he slid a few more photos onto the projector, showing images of Eric at the bar, the bracelet unmistakably in every shot. Dana, sitting beside Eric, shifted in her seat, her eyes cast down, her shoulders slumped in shame. She didn't say anything, but Marjorie could see the disappointment in her posture. The judge looked over at Eric, his face unreadable but his tone unmistakably firm. "This is a serious case, Mr. Lane. We will reconvene tomorrow for the final ruling." Eric's jaw tightened, his fists still clenched, but he said nothing. The weight of the room shifted, the finality of the moment settling over him like a shadow. As the judge adjourned the court, the sense of inevitability in the air was palpable. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore, it was the place where Eric's reckoning would finally begin. Marjorie didn't smile. She didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, and now all she had to do was wait. The day of the verdict arrived quietly, the air outside crisp with the early autumn chill, but inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Marjorie sat at the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the weight of the past few days pressing down on her chest. She wasn't nervous, not anymore. But there was a quiet certainty in her that everything had led to this. Eric sat across the room, his face tight with barely contained. The cocky smirk he'd once worn like armor had been replaced with something more desperate. He knew, deep down, what was coming, but he wasn't going to make it easy. Dana, sitting beside him, stared straight ahead, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the front of the courtroom. She had said little throughout the proceedings, but her posture now spoke volumes. Marjorie could almost feel the regret emanating. The judge entered, his presence commanding, as always. He didn't waste time. He settled into his chair, his gavel coming down sharply. "The court has reviewed the evidence presented," the judge began, his voice firm and unyielding. "The defendant, Mr. Eric Lane, has been found guilty of financial exploitation and fraud. His actions toward his mother were not only unauthorized, but were deliberate and sustained over a period of time." Marjorie held her breath, her hands still folded but now clenching slightly. She had heard the words before, in her mind, but hearing them out loud, spoken in this room, in front of the people who had watched this entire ordeal unfold, felt like a moment she would never forget. Marjorie Lane will be granted full restitution for the financial damages incurred as a result of the defendant's action, the judge continued, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Eric. "Mr. Lane will be required to repay the full amount, with penalties, and the account linked to the medical bracelet will be permanently." The words hit Marjorie like a breath of fresh air, the floodgates of relief opening inside her chest. She hadn't dared to hope for this much, but here it was. The vindication, the justice. Eric's face reddened, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. But the judge wasn't finished. "In addition to restitution," the judge said, his gaze hardening, "Mr. Lane will lose his visitation rights with his daughter, Sophie, until the full debt is repaid. This court does not tolerate the exploitation of family members for personal gain. The defendant's actions have caused harm not just to his mother, but to his daughter as well." The silence in the room was deafening. Marjorie's heart swelled as she looked over at Sophie, who was sitting beside her, her face flushed with a mixture of relief and pride. Sophie had stood by her grandmother throughout this entire ordeal, and now, with the judge's ruling, it was clear that her bravery had been worth it. Sophie reached over, her hand finding Marjorie's, and squeezed it tightly. Marjorie smiled, the warmth in the gesture grounding her, reminding her why she had fought so hard. "Grandma," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Marjorie nodded, her eyes glistening with tears that she refused to "We did," she said quietly. "You were so brave, Sophie. I couldn't have done this without." The judge cleared his throat, signaling the end of the proceedings. "This court is adjourned," he said firmly, banging his gavel once more, his voice final. As people began to file out of the room, Marjorie stood slowly, taking in the overwhelming weight of the. She wasn't just walking out of the courtroom, she was walking away from years of manipulation, from the man who had drained her emotionally and financially. Irene, who had been sitting quietly beside, stood up and placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice low but full of approval. "That's justice, Marjorie. You got it." Marjorie nodded, a small, satisfied smile playing at her lips. She didn't need anyone to tell her what had been won today. She felt it in every fiber of her being. She had fought for herself and for Sophie. She had stood up against the lies, the manipulation, and the fraud. And now, justice had been served. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Marjorie could finally breathe easy. The weight that had been pressing down on her for so long had lifted, and for the first time in years, she felt 10. The appeal I filed approximately 675 words. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the air still thick with the shock of the verdict. Marjorie's heart had barely begun to slow from the adrenaline of the ruling when the news came. Eric wasn't done. He had filed an appeal. The notification arrived in a thick envelope delivered by hand, Marcus's face unreadable as he handed it over. "It's official," he said quietly, his words edged with the weight of inevitability. "Eric's going to fight it." Marjorie didn't know whether to feel anger or a strange sort of relief. She had expected it, of course. Eric was nothing if not relentless, but part of her had hoped the ruling would be enough to end the saga. Apparently, she had underestimated his arrogance. The court date was set quickly. A smaller hearing, just a formality. The judge, who had already ruled in her favor once, would now consider Eric's claim that the court had misunderstood the situation, that this was just a family dispute that had been blown out of proportion. Eric entered the courtroom first, his usual cocky smile once again plastered across his face. He was dressed in his best suit, the one he thought made him look respectable. Dana sat beside him, her posture defensive, arms crossed tightly, but there was no denying the tension between. Marjorie could see it, could feel it in the air. She sat with Marcus, her hands folded, her mind still steady, even as the familiar pang of frustration rose in her chest. Eric had the audacity to claim that it was all a misunderstanding, a miscommunication between mother and son, that the entire thing had been blown out of proportion by a well-meaning but overly dramatic child. The judge entered with a measured calm, his presence bringing the room back to focus. "We're here today for the appeal filed by Mr. Eric Lane," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the room. "Mr. Lane, please proceed." Eric stood, his hands shaking slightly, but his voice was sure. "Your Honor, I don't deny that there were some charges, but they were minor. And frankly, I'm not sure why we're here. It's a family issue, a misunderstanding. My mother and I have always been This has been blown way out of proportion. My daughter's testimony was emotional and inaccurate. She's just a kid who doesn't understand the context." The words dripped with entitlement, with the same manipulative tone he had always used to cover up his failures. Marjorie didn't react, though. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge, knowing that Eric's words would soon fall flat. Marcus rose from his seat, calm and methodical, his expression unreadable. He stood before the judge and placed a small, sleek tablet onto the podium. He clicked a few buttons, and the room fell silent as a video appeared on the screen. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady, "this is not a simple family misunderstanding. What you see here is the defendant's true character. I believe this video will give you the full picture of what this case is about." The video began to play, footage from the day Eric had stormed into Marjorie's house, yelling at her, threatening her, calling her weak. The camera was shaky at first, but the sound was clear. Eric's voice rang out, full of rage and aggression, the same voice that had once made Marjorie shrink back in. "I'm not exaggerating," Marcus said, his tone hard now as the footage continued to play. "This is the real Eric Lane, a man who used his mother, manipulated her for his own gain, and then, when caught, resorted to screaming and threats. The courtroom was silent as Eric's face flashed on the screen, his cocky grin replaced with red-faced fury. His fist slammed the counter, his voice rising in violent protest, the words barely audible through his rage. It was all there, clear as day. His true nature, stripped of the lies. Eric's face twisted, and for a moment, the smugness cracked. His eyes darted around the room, but no one was looking at him anymore. The judge's gaze never wavered from the screen. Dana shifted uncomfortably beside him, her face flushed with shame, but there was nothing she could do. She wasn't a part of this anymore. The judge's voice was calm but firm. Mr. Lane, this video further confirms the court's initial ruling. There was no misunderstanding here. The evidence is irrefutable. The appeal is dismissed. Eric's jaw clenched so tightly that Marjorie could see the muscle twitching. He stood, his face an ugly mask of rage. But before he could say a word, the judge raised his hand. "You will not address this court again, Mr. Lane. The ruling stands." Dana's face crumbled, her eyes wide with disbelief. She glanced at Eric, then slowly, wordlessly, she stood up. She didn't look at Marjorie as she left, but the defeat in her posture was unmistakable. Sophie, sitting beside Marjorie, leaned in slightly, her voice low but full of conviction. "He'll never learn, will he?" Marjorie turned to her, her heart aching for the girl who had been caught in the crossfire of her father's case. She shook her head, a small, sad smile forming on her lips. "No, sweetheart, but that's not my problem anymore." And as the gavel came down once more, signaling the final end to this chapter, Marjorie finally allowed herself to feel the relief wash over her. It was done. Eric's appeal was nothing but the last gasping breath of a man who would never learn the consequences of his actions. The phone call came early, the kind that shatters the silence of a quiet morning. Marjorie had just finished her coffee when she heard Sophie answer the landline, her voice distant and uncertain. "It's for you, Grandma," Sophie said, handing her the receiver with a look that was both curious and wary. Marjorie took the phone, expecting nothing more than another telemarketer or perhaps a call from Irene. But this time, it was different. "Miss Lane?" The voice on the other end was professional but clipped, almost too polite. "I'm calling to inform you that Eric Lane's employment with us has been terminated. We cannot tolerate fraudulent activity, especially not of this nature. His actions have violated our trust, and as a result, he is no longer welcome here." Marjorie blinked, her grip tightening on the receiver. Her mind had already been processing Eric's fall from grace, but hearing it so plainly, from someone so detached, made it feel more real than ever. "Thank you for letting me know," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. She hung up, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't feel triumphant, not really. She felt something else, something closer to relief mixed with a tinge of sadness. Eric had burned every bridge he had left, and now, it seemed, he had nowhere to turn. Across the room, Sophie was sitting quietly at the table, a book open but her attention clearly elsewhere. Is he really going to be okay?" she asked, her voice small, almost hesitant. Marjorie could see the worry in her eyes, the uncertainty about what would come next for her father. "No, sweetheart," Marjorie said gently, her hand resting on Sophie's. "He's not okay. But that's not your problem. And it's not mine. Either." But just as the weight of that finality settled over her, the door slammed open. Dana entered, her face flushed with anger, her movements sharp and forceful. She didn't even look at Marjorie before she turned her attention to Eric, who was sitting in a daze on the couch, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "How could you?" Dana's voice was barely above a whisper, but the fury in it was unmistakable. She paced the room, her hands waving helplessly, her words a blur of accusation and disbelief. "I've been defending you. I've been trying to hold this family together. And this is how you repay me? Getting fired for fraud?" Eric didn't respond right away. He looked lost, staring at the floor, his fists clenching and unclenching, like he was trying to hold on to something solid. Marjorie watched the scene unfold in silence. There was no sympathy left for him. Not anymore. Not after everything. Dana stopped pacing and turned toward the door. I'm done, Eric. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending everything's fine when you're dragging us all down. Without another word, she stormed out, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she disappeared into the hallway. Eric barely looked up. He seemed drained, as if the last reserves of his energy had been sapped away, leaving him with nothing but the hollow shell of his arrogance. But there was no denying it anymore. His empire of lies had crumbled, and he had nothing left to stand on. Sophie looked up at Marjorie, her expression a mixture of sadness and understanding. I want to stay here, Grandma. I don't want to be with him anymore. The words hit Marjorie's heart like a weight. But it wasn't a burden. This wasn't something she could fix. Not for Eric, but for Sophie. For the girl who had been forced to live in the shadow of her father's chaos for far too long. I'll make sure you have a room, Marjorie said softly, her hand gently brushing Sophie's hair. We'll take care of each other. Just like we always have. Irene came in then, her presence a steady force that Marjorie had come to rely on. She leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, a knowing look in her eyes. Rot always eats itself, Marjorie. Eric's made his bed. He'll have to lie in it. Marjorie nodded, her gaze settling on Sophie, who was now standing beside her, her hand resting comfortably in Marjorie's. For the first time in years, Marjorie felt at peace. The battle wasn't over, but the war had already been won. The phone rang again, snapping Marjorie from her thoughts. This time, it was Marcus. I've finalized the trust paperwork, he said, his voice calm but resolute. Everything's in order. You're secure, and the money's in place. Marjorie took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. She had won this battle, not just for herself, but for Sophie. For the future that no longer had to be shaped by the chaos Eric had caused. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the phone down. It's done, Sophie. It's all done. Sophie smiled up at her, the same quiet strength radiating from her that had given Marjorie the courage to stand her ground. Together, they had faced down the storm, and together, they would walk away from it. The letter arrived on a gray, rain-soaked afternoon. It was thick, formal, far too official to be anything but trouble. Marjorie saw the return address and felt a flicker of recognition. Eric's name was scrawled on the envelope, his handwriting as messy as his life. She didn't open it right away. The last few weeks had felt like an emotional battlefield, each day a struggle to leave behind the wreckage he'd left in his wake. And yet, here was one more attempt to drag her back into his mess. Sophie was at the kitchen table, doing her homework, her brows furrowed in concentration. Marjorie paused for a moment, watching her granddaughter, so much stronger than her father ever was. With a sigh, she opened the letter, her fingers steady despite the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. The letter itself was nothing more than a series of excuses and half-apologies. Mom, I know I've done a lot of wrong by you, and I'm sorry for all of it. I never meant to hurt you, and I've always tried to do what's best for us, even if I don't always show it. I was wrong to use your bracelet, but I was just trying to help. I know I've messed up, but I'm asking for one last chance to make things right. Please, let's move past this. I'm your son. Don't let this be the thing that breaks us. Marjorie read the words twice, feeling her stomach twist with the same familiar resentment. He was trying again. Trying to worm his way back into her life with the same tired, the same manipulative language, the same old Eric. When she finished reading, she set the letter down on the table without a word. She didn't need to say anything. The letter itself said it all. It was a desperate plea from someone who didn't understand what it meant to take responsibility, to truly make amends. It was the same Eric, the same child who had stolen from her and lied, and who now thought he could undo it all with words on paper. Sophie looked up from her book, her voice barely a whisper. He doesn't mean it. Marjorie nodded, her heart heavy but steady. No, sweetheart, he doesn't. Irene, who had been sitting nearby sipping her tea, let out a quiet, almost bitter chime. He means he's broke. That's all this is. If he had any real remorse, it wouldn't be in a letter. He would have shown it. Marjorie felt a bitter laugh tug at the corners of her mouth. Irene was right. Eric wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a second chance to take what wasn't his. He wanted to crawl back into her life like nothing had happened. But there was no going back now. She had seen his true nature. She had seen what he was willing. Marcus's voice broke through her thoughts, as calm and businesslike as ever. He'd arrived just as she finished reading. "I've got the updated estate papers," he said, handing her a thick stack of paper, the weight of them settling in her hands like the finality of a sentence. She took the papers from him, her eyes scanning the first page. This was it. The end of it all. The trust. Her will. Everything tied up and finalized. She didn't need Eric any. She didn't need anyone who hadn't fought for her or cared about the consequences of their actions. Marjorie turned to the last page, her fingers brushing over the dotted line where her signature would make everything official. It would make the break, the division, permanent. She took a deep breath, steadying herself for the decision that had to be made, the decision she had already made. Sophie glanced up at her face a mixture of concern and understanding. Marjorie met her granddaughter's gaze and offered a smile, one that was calm and resolute. "This is it," Marjorie said softly, the weight of the moment not lost on her. "This is the end of it." With a firm hand, Marjorie signed the document, sealing the fate of the inheritance, the estate, everything Eric had once thought he could claim. It wasn't about the money, it was about taking control, about setting the boundaries that should have been set long ago. The property, the wealth. It would go to Sophie, to the one who had stood by her when Eric hadn't. It would go to someone who understood what loyalty meant, what family meant, someone who deserved it. Marcus stood silently, watching as Marjorie signed her name with a finality that left no room for doubt. The ink on the page would be the last connection to Eric, and it would be the last thing tying him to the life Marjorie had. "You're secure now," Marcus said, his voice steady as always. "This is the last step." Marjorie stood, looking down at the signed documents, the weight of them settling in her chest. She could feel the tension in her shoulders start to ease, a quiet relief spreading through her. "It's done," she said, looking up at Sophie, who was standing by her side, her eyes soft but filled with quiet strength. Together, they had fought for this. Together, they would move forward, leaving Eric and his endless demands behind. And as the door closed behind them, as they stepped away from the mess Eric had made, Marjorie allowed herself to finally breathe freely, knowing their future, was now safe. The air in Marjorie's living room was still, save for the soft rustle of her as she carefully scanned the final draft of her will. The last few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, of anger and sorrow, but also of clarity about what she deserved, and what her future needed to look like. Today, everything would finally be. Marcus sat across from her, the pages of the will spread out on the table between them, each one a step closer to freedom. His eyes were steady, his presence solid. He had been her anchor through this process, a silent partner in the work of making sure everything was right. She trusted him implicitly, and now, with this final step, the legacy of all her hard work and sacrifice would be secured, free from the shadows of Eric's destruction. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked, his voice low but steady, the question hanging between them like a final breath before the plunge. Marjorie didn't hesitate. She nodded, a small resolute smile tugging at her lips. "I've never been more ready." She looked down at the document in front of her, the words no longer feeling like a list of directives, but like the resolution of a long, painful chapter. Sophie was the sole heir to Marjorie's estate, the house, the savings, everything, contingent on her continuing her education, of course. The legacy would pass into Sophie's hands, the one person who had stayed true to her when everyone else had faltered, the only person who had not betrayed her trust. Marjorie's fingers hovered over the final page where she needed to sign. Her eyes caught the rest of the provisions, her carefully considered choices for the remainder of the estate. A portion to be donated to an elder fraud nonprofit, an organization dedicated to stopping the kind of exploitation Eric had tried to impose on her. It was fitting, almost poetic. Eric had stolen from her, so she would give back, in his name, to protect others like her. As Marjorie's pen finally touched the page, she felt the weight lift off her shoulders. She was done with the past. This was her future, and it would no longer be defined by a son who couldn't understand boundaries. Marcus took the pen from her hand, running his eyes over the document one last time. With a deep breath, he stamped it, the sound of the ink pressing into the paper final and unyielding. "Everything is airtight," he said, looking up with a small smile. "No room for doubt. You're secure now." Marjorie felt a quiet thrill run through her, the tension in her body releasing like a spring that had been wound too tightly for too long. She felt free, free from the constant fear of Eric's demands, free from the weight of his manipulation. The future she had built with hard work and sacrifice was now safe, and the future of the granddaughter she had raised would be just as solid. She looked across the room at Sophie, who was sitting quietly, her eyes filled with an understanding that went beyond her years. Sophie had watched her grandmother fight for everything they had, and now, with the final piece of the puzzle in place, she could feel the shift. She was safe. They were safe. "You did it, Grandma," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with awe and quiet pride. "You really did it." Marjorie smiled, the weight of everything finally sinking in. "We did it, Sophie. You've been with me through all of this. You've earned this as much as I have." Irene, who had been standing by the door, her arms crossed, smiled with a knowing glint in her eye. "He'll die thirsty, you know, never understanding what it means to be full." Marjorie looked at Irene, a small chuckle escaping her lips. "I'm full," she said quietly, the truth of her words resonating deep within her, "full of love, full of peace, and full of everything I need. And for the first time in a long while, I'm free." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the words settling between them. In the distance, the sound of rain tapping softly against the window seemed to underscore the stillness, the calm after the storm. Marjorie's gaze shifted back to Sophie, who was now sitting beside her, her hand resting in Marjorie's. The bond between them felt stronger than ever, unbreakable. Outside, the world continued, indifferent to the battles fought and won in the silence of their home. But in here, in this quiet room, it felt as though everything had shifted. Eric's shadow was gone. The legacy he had tried to build on lies and manipulation had crumbled. And now, Marjorie stood at the threshold of a new chapter, with the future of her family firmly in her hands. And for the first time in years, she could breathe easy, knowing she was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had built and what she had reclaimed. For Marjorie Lane, the fight was over, and the victory, quiet but powerful, was hers. The studio lights were brighter than Marjorie expected, warmer too. The set was modest, just two chairs facing each other and a row of cameras, but something about the space felt heavy with purpose. She had been hesitant when the call came in, a local news outlet wanting to do a story on elder fraud and the recent case that had made quiet waves through the county courthouse. Her case. At first, she thought of declining. Let sleeping dogs lie. Let the door stay shut on Eric and everything that came. But then she looked at Sophie, growing stronger every day, more sure of herself, and remembered the nights they sat at the kitchen table talking about how silence was. That silence is where people like Eric thrived. So she said, now, sitting under the lights, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Marjorie Lane faced the woman across from her, a well-spoken anchor named Janelle, dressed in sharp blue and carrying the polite curiosity of someone who knew this story was more than clickbait. "We're here today," Janelle began, "with Marjorie Lane, a retired nurse and grandmother who stood up against her own son in a landmark case of elder financial abuse. Her courage has not only inspired others, but has started conversations across the state." Marjorie didn't fidget. She didn't blush. She simply nodded, her voice steady when she answered. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just stopped letting myself be used." Janelle smiled gently. "That may be true in your eyes. But in the eyes of your community, you're something of a hero." The screen behind them lit up with the headline, Mother outsmarts son who drained bracelet account. Below it, a photo of Marjorie leaving the courthouse, Sophie at her side, both of them looking calm, composed, whole. As the interview went on, Marjorie spoke openly but without embellishment. She talked about how the bracelet was meant for emergency, how it had become a weapon in her. She described the lies, the gaslighting, the disbelief, even from people close to her. She recounted the night she decided enough was enough. I wasn't just saving myself, she said at one point, her voice firm but not bitter. I was showing my granddaughter that we are allowed to set boundaries, even with people we love, especially with people we love. In the viewing room outside the studio, Sophie sat next to Irene, eyes wide as she watched the feed live on a wall-mounted screen. Her hands were clasped under her chin, lips slightly parted as if afraid to miss a single word. She's killing it, Irene whispered, her voice filled with admiration. She's incredible, Sophie replied, eyes never leaving the screen. She stopped herself, then smiled. She's a hero. Back in the studio, the interview wrapped. Janelle extended her hand, her expression earnest. Thank you for telling your story. You're helping people more than you know. Marjorie stood, shaking her hand firmly. If it stops even one person from going through what I did, it'll have been worth it. When she stepped into the lobby afterward, she was met with applause. Not loud, not showy, just the scattered clapping of staff members and interns who had watched from the wings. Sophie rushed up to her, arms thrown around her waist. You were amazing, she whispered into Marjorie's shoulder. People are going to remember this. Marjorie hugged her back, holding on a second longer than necessary. Then let them remember. Let them remember the truth. Marcus was waiting by the exit, a folded copy of the day's paper tucked under his arm. Without saying a word, he handed it to her. The headline matched the one on the screen. Below it, in smaller print, was a subheading. I wasn't going to let him win. Your name's safe now, Marcus said, his voice quiet but certain. And that story, it belongs to you. Marjorie glanced down at the photo, the one they'd taken of her and Sophie leaving court. She looked older than she remembered, a little more tired, but stronger too, wiser, unapologetic. She looked up at Marcus and smiled. I think I finally believe that. Irene chimed in from behind her, a sly grin tugging at her. You just buried him with the truth, Marjorie. There's no coming back from that. No, Marjorie said calmly, folding the paper and tucking it under her arm. And I wouldn't let him, even if he tried. As they stepped outside into the cool afternoon light, Sophie at her side, Marjorie breathed in deep. This time, it wasn't relief. It was pride. The morning sun spilled across the kitchen counter like honey, warm and slow. Marjorie sat at the table, the familiar bracelet resting in her. For years it had clung to her wrist like a lifeline, an emergency alert system tied directly to her heart, her health, her safety. Now it meant something else entirely. She held a small silver charm between her fingers, a heart, no bigger than a thumbnail. Sophie had found it in a little gift shop 2 towns over, nestled in a velvet-lined tray of trinkets. On its back, etched in tiny script, were the words, "Still beating." Marjorie smiled as she clasped the charm onto the band. It clicked into place like it had always belonged there. Is it too heavy? Sophie asked, leaning over the table. Marjorie looked up, her eyes warm. No, it's exactly the right weight. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, the way she had hundreds of times before. But this time, it wasn't about fear. It wasn't about monitoring or risk. It was about ownership, control, freedom. Sophie reached out and took her hand without a word. Their fingers fit together easily, the way they had the night Sophie was born, the day she came to live with Marjorie, and every step since. In the living room, Irene watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a crooked smile playing on her lips. Stronger than ever, she said, nodding. He thought he could drain you dry. Instead, you came out gleaming. Marjorie chuckled softly. Funny how rot doesn't know when the roots are still strong. From the hallway, Marcus appeared, holding a slim manila folder, the very last of the paperwork, he said. Trusts filed, titles transferred, estate locked down like Fort Knox. He handed it to Marjorie with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he had helped build something solid. Your legacy's secured, he said. Your granddaughter's protected. And Eric, he's got nothing to come back for. She nodded slowly, flipping through the final pages. There was nothing left to revise. Nothing left to give away. She had taken everything he tried to twist and turned it into something unshakable. I was always going to survive, Marjorie murmured. I just had to stop asking permission. Marcus smiled, then tipped an imaginary hat. And you did. Outside, the breeze picked up slightly, rustling the curtains. The house felt open again, lighter. No more locks double-checked out of paranoia. No more silence steeped in tension. Just the slow, quiet rhythm of healing. Marjorie stood from the table, her hand still wrapped around Sophie's. She took a deep breath, her chest rising steady and full. The bracelet beeped faintly once, just a status check. The sound used to spike her anxiety. Now, it felt like a pulse she owned. My bracelet, she said, glancing at it with affection, is mine again. They walked out into the yard, just the two of them, while Irene and Marcus lingered inside. Sophie skipped ahead toward the garden, calling out for Marjorie to follow. The girl's laugh floated through the air like music, unburdened. Marjorie paused at the porch steps, closed her eyes, and tilted her face to the sun. The warmth bathed her skin, and for a brief, beautiful moment, the world fell quiet except for the sound of her own breath and the slow, calm beat of her heart. Eric was gone. Not literally, not yet, but in every way that mattered. No more court hearing, no more desperate letters, no more shrinking into silence. He had underestimated her. He had confused age for weakness. He had mistaken love for access. Marjorie opened her eyes and looked down at her wrist. The silver charm caught the sunlight, its message glinting back at her, still beating. And it was. She descended the steps, her body steady, her heartbeat sure. As she joined Sophie in the grass, she let the final thought rise up from her chest. Not bitter, not smug, just true. My son used my medical bracelet to buy himself drinks, so I used his credit card to buy the judge's time. And with that, Marjorie Lane stepped into her life, finally hers again.